Okay, so now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome today's first speaker, Jacqueline Hall, Senior Vice President with Ipsos User Experience. Jacqueline, you have the floor.
Thanks, Ellen. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to be here discussing a topic that so many folks are passionate about and interested in, us included. And that means today we'll be delving into what it means to create inclusive products and experiences through accessible user experience research. We'll also be sharing some tips and insights about accessible UX that you can take with you and immediately start putting into practice. Before we get started, we'd like to introduce ourselves. My name is Jacqueline Hall, as Ellen said. For those who may be curious, I have shoulder-length brown hair and I'm wearing my New York uniform, which is a black t-shirt. I use the pronoun she, her. I am a Senior Vice President at Ipsos UX here in Ipsos North America, and I'm based in Brooklyn with my lovely partner and dog. I've been at Ipsos for 8 years, according to LinkedIn, and have focused a majority of the last 2 on accessible and inclusive UX. And I'm joined today by my fantastic colleague, Jody.
Thanks, Jacqueline. So my name's Jody Alm. I'm a senior UX researcher here at Ipsos. I joined Ipsos a little under 2 years ago, and I work across sectors doing both remote research and in-person research at our labs here in Chicago, where I'm based. I'm also involved with one of our client-dedicated accessibility panels. So I'm excited to be here talking today about accessible UX. Today I'm presenting from my Chicago apartment. I'm wearing a dark shirt and my pronouns are she, her.
Thanks, Jody. So in terms of what today's content looks like, we'll begin with what we're calling the why, the business case for accessible UX. Then we'll shift to the what and highlight some of the key principles of accessible UX as we see them at Ipsos. In the second half of today's presentation, we'll dive into what has been learned, or what we have learned, and what can be done in this space, and discuss the how, providing you 5 tips for accessible UX research, and end with answering a question that we get all of the time from clients, which is, what can I do, and what can I do now? So we hope to demystify that together. First, why should we care as businesses, as organizations, teams? Perhaps many of you don't actually need much of a case for this, but perhaps you have experienced folks within your organization or in your lives who do. So we hope we can help make the business case for accessible UX today a little more clear. There are many reasons that accessible UX matters, but we'd like to highlight a few stats that we feel are compelling, and we'll get into a little bit more detail momentarily. But first, over 16% of the global population lives with a disability, and in the US, it's estimated that people with disabilities have $1.2 trillion of disposable income to spend annually. So there's obviously a huge opportunity to create products and experiences that people with disabilities can use and enjoy. That said, making products usable for people with disabilities has benefits beyond growing the addressable market for products and services and beyond increasing revenue. There are other pressures to pay attention to. More than 40 countries now have mandatory web accessibility standards known as WCAG. And failure to meet those standards can result in costly litigation from current or prospective customers and regulatory groups. In addition, we don't have to tell you that it's a competitive market, but we know that in the US, 71% of users with disabilities, they will leave a website if it's not accessible, meaning they'll go elsewhere. And this is not always a choice. They don't necessarily want to leave the experience. It's a necessity when the site will not allow them to navigate to or consume content or complete simple tasks like making a purchase or searching for local events or checking their bank account, or as Jody will talk about a bit later, searching for a job. So next, we'll dive a little deeper on a few of these points. First, expanded market reach. By ensuring that digital products are accessible, businesses can tap into this substantial market segment, expanding the reach and increasing potential revenue, of course. There are 4 main disability groups that we're referring to, or groups of people with disabilities. We have blind or low vision, D-deaf or hard of hearing, physical or mobility impairments, and cognitive or intellectual impairments. It is important to note that many folks have more than one disability and or do not fit neatly into or identify with solely one of these groups. Additionally, many disabilities are invisible, could be unknown to the person, undiagnosed, or underdiagnosed in certain populations, all of which is often dependent upon access to healthcare. So we want to acknowledge that these are not neat little boxes that you can think of like, oh, user group 1, user group 2. No, this is, as you'll hear us talk about for the remainder of this webinar, this is complex stuff, and that includes the people and the individuals who we're speaking about. Additionally, accessible products benefit other user groups, such as those with temporary impairments, perhaps a broken arm or an ear infection, and you're not able to hear as clearly. I myself get migraines, and in those times, they are bleak, and I cannot look at a screen. So these temporary disabilities or moments in which you may need accessibility features are vast. Also, by 2050, global life expectancy is projected to rise to 77. And this means 1 in 5 people will be over the age of 60. This will absolutely increase the need for an impact of accessible UX. Finally, as Jody will talk about shortly, those without disabilities often use accessibility features within their product experiences. So in short, it's an ever-expanding market for you to address. Next, an investment in accessible UX demonstrates your commitment to social inclusivity and responsibility. Especially over the past few years, we've seen many brands stand out for doing this well, or perhaps not so well. Taking accessibility seriously can positively impact a company's brand reputation, attracting customers who value these principles who may or may not have a disability. Additionally, accessible products can foster loyalty among customer groups and folks with disabilities, as they're more likely to continue to use the product, to talk about the product. We know through a lot of our research that folks in this group are very vocal about the brands and the products that are meeting their needs. They acknowledge perhaps it's their needs that they are meeting, but hey, this could work for you too. So we know that they evangelize the products, the services, and the experiences that they're finding easy to use and relevant. And lastly, there is that elephant in the room, and today the elephant is named compliance. So as we mentioned, over 40 countries have web accessibility standards. Non-compliance can lead to costly lawsuits and fines and damage to the reputation, as we've already acknowledged. But by proactively addressing accessibility, businesses can mitigate the legal risks and maintain a more positive public image. We want to acknowledge here that often compliance is requiring the bare minimum. And so by no means are we saying that's enough. And we'll talk a lot about how this is a work in progress, but this is the antithesis of our philosophy, that compliance is enough. And we should always strive to do better simply than what's expected. And we're excited to help you do that. So what types of questions can we help answer with accessible UX? Here are some of the business questions that accessible UX can solve for. Like 1, how is your website or app failing to serve users with accessibility needs? How can you ensure that users with diverse abilities can access essential information and services on your platform? Maybe what accessibility features should you prioritize because there are countless? Maybe what barriers might cause users with disabilities to abandon your product experience in favor of another one? How can you enhance the integration between your accessible online experience and your offline services? Often folks are going between online and offline as they attempt to complete a task. They're often going between devices. So starting on mobile and going to laptop because certain tasks are easier. So what is that user journey? And on that note, the last question here, what are the critical points in that user journey that might pose challenges for users with disabilities? And how can we mitigate some of these challenges? We have a pretty strong perspective in how we should show up as we start to think about how to answer these questions, and Jody will share a bit more on our philosophy.
Thanks, Jacqueline. So we know accessible UX is not just the right thing to do, it's not just good, but it's good for business. So what exactly is accessible UX? We'll take you through some examples and then lay out several ground rules that Ipsos uses when approaching accessibility work. The first thing to know about accessible UX is that designing with people with disabilities in mind can generate overall better design. Instead of thinking of users who use assistive technology as an edge case or edge users, think about solving accessibility design problems as a key strategy to finding the best designs for everyone. For example, simpler UX tends to be more accessible for screen reader users and voice control software users. Simple UX is also generally the best UX for any user. Additionally, accessibility features can become widely popular, such as the use of speech to text, something that makes it possible for a user with limited hand dexterity to efficiently input text is also a convenient tool for anyone. Many people use voice controls for their phone when driving. The speech-to-text capabilities also come in handy for anyone when trying to get work done with a child in their arms, for example, because childcare fell through that day. So with this in mind, let's go through a few specific examples of good accessible UX that are out there. The BBC website is a top-notch example for accessible news websites and websites in general. Its pages consistently earn solid scores on accessibility scanning tools. And as Emma Pratt-Rickens, who works on accessibility for BBC, has said, knowledge is possibly the real key in delivering accessible experiences, making sure that people know what they should be doing. The wider that knowledge can go, the earlier that people can start learning about accessibility. It then just becomes built into what they do and becomes natural. Like, why would you ever build any other way? You can see this mindset in the BBC's work. The website's keyboard navigation is notable. Pressing the tab key twice reveals a skip to content option, so users can avoid the extensive navigation in the page header. And if you press tab again, you're given an accessibility help option that links to a page of useful links. Simple keyboard navigation is good design that makes a website work well with both screen readers and voice control software. Simple keyboard navigation is also good design for anyone, even if you use neither of these assistive technologies. You might consider the last time you were multitasking while eating lunch at your desk. Eating with one hand while tabbing through the site instead of navigating with your mouse or trackpad is a lot less messier. Not only is it good design, but features like these show that the BBC is committed to providing accessible content and always considers this portion of its audience, which helps build brand loyalty, as Jacqueline talked about. Another brand that has shown a commitment to accessible UX is PlayStation. Standard gaming controllers are often incompatible with prosthetics and other assistive technologies for people with limited or no use of their hands. Herman Holst, head of PlayStation Studios, has said this about accessible design. Creating an accessible world for gamers motivates us and inspires our work. At PlayStation Studios, we aspire to craft gaming content that not only delivers immersive experiences, but also allows gamers to create meaningful connections as we have so much in common through the shared joy of play. So instead of leaving it to their users to come up with creative workarounds, which gamers with disabilities were already doing, the designers at PlayStation prioritized developing hardware that makes it possible for these gamers to have the same level of immersive, connected experience that any gamer using a standard controller can have. They did this in part by conducting iterative UX testing with users with disabilities. Again here, the benefits of accessible design reach beyond users with disabilities. Many gamers enjoy building their own computers, for example, to maximize performance. And similarly, a lot of gamers enjoy the fully customizable capabilities of these controllers. In 2021, MasterCard introduced the Touch Card to help blind and low vision customers distinguish between their credit, debit, and prepaid cards. Raja Rajamanar, CMCO at MasterCard, said this at product launch. The touch card will provide a greater sense of security, inclusivity, and independence to the 2.2 billion people around the world with visual impairments. For the visually impaired, identifying their payment cards is a real struggle. This tactile solution allows consumers to correctly orient the card and know which payment card they are using. So instead of these card users having to create their own systems for keeping cards separate, MasterCard decided to put the same level of thought and care into designing cards for users who rely on tactile cues as they do for sighted consumers who typically rely on visual cues to distinguish and use cards. The end result, again, is a product that many users enjoy regardless of their level of vision. Anyone who's fished for a card in your pocket or bag in a dark restaurant trying to get to that check before someone else does will appreciate this design. Now that we've seen a few examples of what we mean by accessible UX, I'll turn it back over to Jacqueline, who's going to talk about some key principles and ground rules that guide our accessible UX practice here at Ipsos.
Yeah, so how did these brands do it? Where did they start? As a crowd of many UX researchers and designers, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir to some extent when I say that putting users at the center of your work does actually transform the products and experiences that you create. And this is exactly what these brands have done. So similar to philosophies of inclusive or user-centered design, accessible UX also demands putting users with accessibility needs at the center of the process. It's critical to understand them, understand their needs and pain points before attempting to solve for them. But ultimately, you are aiming to solve through product and service and experience design. But when does it make sense to consider accessible UX in your product design lifecycle? To do it, you need to shift left. To shift left means to bring in accessibility early on in the design and development, rather than waiting until the end of a development lifecycle or after a product has been released. Many accessibility initiatives, perhaps you're familiar, are a result of users identifying or coming across accessibility or usability issues, potentially even taking legal action after something is already in the wild. So shifting left benefits not only users with disabilities, but all of us, including the business, by enabling designers, developers, researchers, and product owners to incorporate accessible UX much more early on. It requires a much smaller investment from the collective team and has a huge impact on users' lived experiences. Accessible UX, in short, cannot be an afterthought. And this quote, I think, perfectly captures this idea. And I think Mark Pennycook of Capital One, so Senior Director of Accessibility, states, if you're making blueberry muffins and you forget to put the blueberries in once the muffins are baked, it is really hard to put blueberries back into the muffin. I dare you to try. So what should you keep in mind as you start to think about incorporating accessible UX into your product design lifecycle? We have some ground rules for that. First ground rule is a popular phrase in the accessibility community, which is nothing about us without us. Don't design products without our involvement, because we know our experience is best. And they're never generalizing, they're always talking from their own individual point of view. And this means we need to involve participants throughout the entire process, not just the field work, not just reactions to the built product, but through the whole thing. So this isn't about consultation or bringing your users in for field work or interviews. It's important to partner with folks from the very beginning on the research design, on the specific questions that you're asking, on the solutions, right? There's a lot of co-creation that can be a great part of solving UX problems, especially with this community. Second, we like to say start at the start. We're focused on research here, and the only way to do research is with participants. And if you do not have an inclusive and accessible way of recruiting folks to participate, you're not ever going to get started. So you need to ensure that the entry point for your work, for your research, for working with your teams is accessible as well. Recruiting for this type of research can certainly be a challenge. It's important to vet the partners that you're working with to ensure that their ways of working are accessible, their ways of contacting participants or sending reminders or checking in on homework or pre-work. All of that needs to be taken into consideration. And we've found at Ipsos that it's really helpful to partner with local organizations and advocacy groups because, one, it's an effective way to recruit. Oftentimes these orgs are really plugged into the community. They're made up of the community. There are people with disabilities leading the charge at these places. And two, it kind of lives by that initial ground rule, which is nothing about us without us. Third, this is complex stuff. Accessible UX research takes more time and has different considerations than perhaps what you're used to in traditional research. It doesn't mean more. I think that's where we need to start to tweak how we're thinking about this. Sure, it's complexity, but anything that is new can feel complex until you figure it out. So you have to be intentional about scoping the appropriate time for the entire project. You not only need to adjust your recruiting approach, as we just talked about, which does take longer, you need to consider the session times, the session duration, the schedule. For the moderator, perhaps, because often you're talking about or hearing about emotional experiences, and that can be a lot for someone to be navigating. But more importantly, understanding that not everyone can engage for the 60 to 90-minute session time that we're used to. We want to pack it all in, but sometimes you actually need to split out the sessions into two because perhaps someone who's using assistive tech gets really tired after talking for 30 minutes. Maybe their schedule or what they have to deal with in terms of their health outside of the interview requires them to take breaks. And so you just have to be incredibly flexible as you navigate this. But we promise it's all worth it because, as our final ground rule states, it's about progress, not perfection. If you're doing this work, you're in it to make a difference. You have to be. It's important to remember that we're in this to make products and services, experiences more accessible by improving design. We're not just taking from the community for recruitment and research purposes. We're not just in it to learn. That's part of it. But really, we're here to give back to the community by impacting product and experience design to better the lives of real people. And you won't always get it right, and that's okay. It's about committing to constant improvement. And it starts with shifting left and investing in accessible UX really early on. We do have some tips for how you can conduct this type of research, which Jody will talk to you about next.
Thanks, Jacqueline. So here at Ipsos UX, we conduct accessibility-focused research on a variety of product types across multiple industries. But what I'm going to talk about today is we recently conducted internal research on the online job search experience for people with disabilities. And we'd like to share some learnings from that process in the form of 5 tips for accessible UX research. So first, a bit about what we did. We interviewed 3 groups of researchers, or no, we didn't interview researchers. We interviewed 3 groups of users: blind, low vision screen reader users, users with limited mobility who use voice control software instead of a keyboard and mouse, and deaf or hard of hearing users who communicate through American Sign Language. We did in-depth interviews that consisted of a general discussion about their job search experience, as well as task-based usability testing of an online job search site. Participants shared their experiences navigating the many accessibility barriers at all stages of the job search process, from identifying disability-friendly employers who are serious about workplace accommodations and not just throwing that on their job post because they're legally required to filling out job application forms that simply weren't accessible. What we want to focus on in this webinar, though, are the research practices that we used and some general tips we put together as a result of this research. So, the first tip for conducting accessible UX research is to demonstrate empathy and sensitivity, and it starts with educating yourself. Do your homework, take the time to learn about the common barriers faced by the types of users that you want to do research with. This goes a long way to building trust. When we embarked on our online job search study, we had our team go through training with an accessibility research expert, both newer team members and more seasoned accessibility researchers who'd been doing this work already. By educating yourself, you can also avoid being offensive or insensitive. This fear is often a barrier to people getting started in this work, particularly if you don't have a disability. One common mistake is invasive questioning. You probably need to know what assistive technology a participant uses, but you will rarely, if ever, need to know personal medical information. For example, in recruiting online job seekers with disabilities, our screener asked about things like screen reader use or ASL proficiency, but we didn't ask things like medical diagnoses or length of impairment. So keep invasive, unnecessary questions out of your screeners, out of your discussion guides, and always approach participants as full humans with a variety of types of feedback to offer, not just feedback on accessibility or usability. Second, commit to the investment. Expect to spend more time and more money versus your standard UX research project. This means plan for more time to prepare for fieldwork, including thinking through the accessibility of everything from recruitment screeners to the directions to your labs or office if you're doing in-person research. Plan to spend more time finding the right participants for your study, and make sure you compensate your participants appropriately, especially if you're asking them to travel to your labs or other field location. Remember that finding accessible transportation can be difficult. Our interviews with online job seekers were conducted remotely, and we found we needed extra time for troubleshooting technical difficulties related to screen sharing and assistive technologies. In any remote interview, you can encounter technical difficulties, but when you start layering on different devices and different software, that can quickly get complicated. We were glad we had spread out moderation responsibilities across multiple team members, so in a given day, we had more than one moderator running sessions. If you set the right expectations going in, you can also minimize pushback from stakeholders along the way when they want to know why something's taking longer than they thought it would, or why your team is asking for additional budget. So as always, setting expectations going in is important. Third, embrace and involve expertise. People with disabilities are experts in their own experience, and in fact, many are freelance or part-time usability consultants. While it's always best practice to get a range of users in a study, from newer or less sophisticated users to, for some studies, super users, don't filter out these professional accessibility testers. Assistive technology users overall tend to be experts with their technology because they have to be. You won't be introducing bias in your sample with this type of participant, but you will be bringing in participants who are very good at articulating their pain points during an interview. We had more than one participant in our online job study who worked in some capacity as a part-time usability tester or accessibility consultant, and having these participants involved enriched our insights. Fourth, building on what Jacqueline said, be flexible. Make accommodations, be ready to problem solve. You'll probably need to do some things different. Make sure your processes are accessible, not just the recruitment, but how will you pay people? Adjust your moderation style to fit the flow of any assistive technology or interpretation being used. So in our example, doing remote in-depth interviews with online job seekers, our moderators found they needed to slow down or change the flow of their moderation to fit the situation. When interviewing a user with an ASL interpreter, keep in mind that the participant can't both watch what you're doing on the screen and also watch the interpreter to find out what you're saying at the same time. Likewise, when interviewing a participant using voice control software, keep in mind that they will have to use a voice command to turn their software off every time they respond to you, and then use a voice command to turn it back on in order to complete a task. So structure your discussion guides around these unique needs for the flow of a session, and prep your moderators to adjust their style. And lastly, be in it for the impact. Simply put, be in it for the right reasons. You're not just here to learn, you're here to make a difference. We chose the online job search process for our internal research because this is a high impact accessibility issue. The United Nations estimates that the unemployment rate for people with disabilities in industrialized countries is between 50 and 70%, nearing 80 to 90% in developing countries. There's many factors that lead into this, including barriers to education, housing, transportation. Also, these data do not include rates of underemployment. Many people with disabilities are locked out of occupations they are highly qualified for and end up in lower paying jobs or working part-time when they want to work full-time because the work is simply not accessible. If you're here today, we know you care about this topic, so keep that passion and purpose as you embark on building out or scaling up accessible UX at your organization. And to recap our tips here, demonstrate empathy and sensitivity, commit to the investment, embrace and involve expertise, be flexible, and be in it for the impact. I'll turn it back over to Jacqueline to talk about what you can do today.
Thanks, Jody. We promised that we would leave you with what you can do about it. How can you get started? And so without further ado, what can you do today? There is a lot, and there is a lot more than what we will even cover in this webinar, and we're always available to talk about it, first and foremost. But let's go through what you can do on your own. What we say here is dive in and learn. We've kind of talked about this throughout the webinar today, but don't be afraid to start small. There is a lot to learn, but don't let that intimidate you. Do your homework and leverage existing free resources. There is a ton of content out there. Don't be afraid to start to dive into it. We, the Ipsos UX team, are certainly here to help. We have a group of very invested researchers and designers on our team in our accessibility working group who regularly meet, who write, who brainstorm on this topic. And we have extensive resources that we can share with you. But the biggest thing to take away is the world is your oyster in this case. You can look up YouTube videos. You can start to use accessibility features on your devices, on your phone or on your laptop, right? Part of your work could be actually leveraging some of the features that are used in the products that you create. That's a great way to start. And it's not starting too small. No such thing. Second, what you can do today with your team. Audit and explore. So first, start by assessing your current ways of working, specifically your research processes internally, perhaps with participants, with agencies, with Ipsos even. Consider how you might integrate accessibility into the work of your immediate team and all of the stuff that you're already doing. For example, you could start to recruit a subset of participants for all studies who have a disability of some kind. Sure, you're not going to get a representative sample. That's not the point. It's not how many people you have, but who you have in the studies. You can plan a small pilot study. Talking to even a few users with disabilities will open your team to new ways of thinking about usability and provide a foundation for incorporating accessibility into your product roadmap. At Ipsos, we can help you stand up this research smoothly. We have strong partnerships with the recruiters and local organizations that we mentioned. We've done a lot of work in this area. And so it is kind of a, how do I gear up? How do I get started? And again, we are here to help, but it starts with having conversations and auditing what you're currently doing and exploring perhaps small ways that you could change what you're currently doing. As an organization, what can you do? Ultimately, engage and evangelize. So facilitate conversation, perhaps on your own, in one-on-one meetings if you're passionate about the topic, perhaps in team meetings, starting to just bring this up as a thing that is on the radar, a part of the conversation, a voice at the table, even if you're not someone with a disability. It's important to identify key stakeholders who see the value in accessibility within your org, who are willing to be an ally and a change agent. Perhaps there are people in your organization that are already committed to making your brand more accessible from a compliance perspective. Perhaps they're starting to think proactively about innovation and features that you could employ in the future, but not yet. Or perhaps they simply care deeply about the brand and the brand's reputation. And this is a great way to start incorporating accessibility into that. Engage them as allies and make a plan for bringing other key stakeholders on board. One way to do this is through sharing stories about the research, about a specific interview conducted, perhaps about a product insight and the impact that someone with a disability helped to identify or reveal in your product experience. Don't forget to share success stories, no matter how small, to drum up excitement. Hey, we changed this one thing because we involved 5 people in our usability test, right? Again, never too small. And another way to do this is through working sessions or hands-on workshops It could be remote, it could be in person. We do a lot of these at Ipsos, facilitating small teams, larger teams. We can kind of accommodate all of those sizes to start thinking about what is your process as an organization? What is your structure as an organization? How can we start to think about accessibility and start to seamlessly incorporate it into what we do each and every day? As you can see, and as you've heard today, there are plenty of ways to get started. We're excited for you to take all of this with you, to share it with those you encounter day to day, whether it's on your team or just in your life. Maybe even report back to us on how it goes. We'd also love to partner with you in this process and in this journey. So, we're all ears is basically the sum up of all of that. Thank you so much for your time today. I believe we have, I can't see a clock or any faces, but I think we have some time for questions. And Jody, I know you've been monitoring the chat. So thanks again for joining us.
I have. We're at 12:40, so we've got about 5 minutes. And we've got a question here. Curious. This is actually a suggestion about icons white on orange or yellow, and that they don't pass the contrast standard. So appreciate that call out. We will address that in our deck. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Oh, we got some more coming in. Okay. Another one, where should we start? Are there certain types of disabilities or assistive tech we should consider first? I can take that one. So I think probably the most important thing is to consider both the impact and the effort. And so your team or organization may have done this for lots of things, right? There's kind of a typical a quadrant type thing where you have a lot of ideas and you try to say, what's a lower impact, what's a higher impact, what is something we could do now, that's lower effort, and what's higher effort. And then you really go for those high impact, lower effort items. And that's going to depend a lot on what your product is. It's going to depend a lot on what users you're trying to reach, what users you currently have. Okay, the next one.
I have one thought to add there, actually, Jody.
Sure.
So I can speak to what we've seen many organizations do here, and that is a heavy focus on blind or low vision at the beginning. We manage a couple of accessibility panels for clients in different sectors, and both of them started with recruiting blind or low vision participants for the panel. So they're regularly engaging in research, and this is largely because a lot of the compliance expectations relate to the assistive tech that is used by this group, and we know there is heavy assistive technology used by this group of folks. And so I guess in a nutshell, where to start? A lot of organizations and teams start with blind or low vision and incorporating those participants into your studies, especially as you're testing online experiences or physical products, anything.
All right, next one we have here. How do I deal with pushback from leaders who don't value accessible UX or don't want to make the investment? So I'll kick that one over to you, Jacqueline. That's a hard one.
Yeah, oh, great. Send them this webinar. No, I'm just kidding. No, in all seriousness, data, case studies, success case studies, I suppose I should say. Unfortunately, I think bringing failures to the table can be a good way to demonstrate what happens if you don't invest. And if you do actually think back to our shift left slide, the investment early is quite small. And so while the dollar amount is one component of this, I also think it's important to think about how do you make it, I know you were talking about this a second ago, Jody, in terms of like effort, but make it a low lift. So make it a change in your process or in your research approach, or perhaps in your ways of working internally that is a low lift, it's easy to incorporate. I keep coming back to that example of starting to recruit folks who have disabilities into each and every study. And maybe it's not a full study dedicated to it. Perhaps you have to start to demonstrate the value of this type of work. But I think incorporating folks into a study, we did this once with a client who was very new to accessibility. We were doing personas, and we included folks with disabilities across the different personas and just highlighted some of the experiences that the individuals had who fell into a specific persona, but who expressed a need that seemed to be specifically because of their accessibility needs. So that can be a good way to start building the case.
Okay. I've got another one here. Do the handouts cover the business value of accessible UX? If not, where do you recommend we gather that type of info to generate conversations at work about incorporating accessible UX into the design process?
Love it. Fantastic question. Yes, there are two PDFs within the little section, handout section, I believe, and one of them discusses kind of our capabilities as a UX team in general and briefly highlights the accessibility offers that we have. And then the other one, I believe, speaks to actually, it might just speak to the accessibility offers themselves, but we will be sending and sharing this deck that has that has those slides. I'm so sorry, I misspoke at first, but you will have that information absolutely in some way. And if you have any questions about what our sources are, where we got that information, we can also share the primary research that was done. All right, I believe we are at time. And
yeah, and let me read one more comment here because it builds off of what you said to the last question. Yes, IXDF says blind assistive tech accesses 70% of disabilities, so great to start with blind low vision respondents.
Awesome, thank you. And thank you everyone for participating in a webinar chat. I feel like that, it can be that scary thing to start typing into the abyss. So we really appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining. Ellen, I think you had a few more words to share before we wrap.
Well, yes, actually, I really wanted to give my heartfelt thanks to both you, Jacqueline and Jody, for today's really interesting presentation, and I loved the discussion. So thank you all for joining us as well. If you have any more questions, the team here will be happy to respond by email. In the meantime, later this week, you should expect a link to today's recorded presentation. And then don't forget, there are some handouts in the event control panel, which we will also make available together with the recording. So that's it. Have a wonderful day, everyone. That concludes today's webinar.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, Ellen and Jody. Have a wonderful day.